I'm Samuel Otter, professor of English here at Berkeley. My field is 19th century American literature, and it's my great honor to welcome Jake Heggie and Gene Scheer to campus to talk about their Moby-Dick opera. It premiered the opera in Dallas in 2010, and it received its San Francisco premiere last night. Well, I'll introduce John Kapusta in a few minutes, but he was lucky enough to be at opening night last night. Thank you all for coming. Welcome to those of you who've come from the San Francisco Opera. I know that our Dean of Humanities, Anthony Cascardi, who couldn't be here today, and the director of the Townsend Center for the Humanities here at Berkeley are both very interested in closer collaborations with the opera and with its artists. So we're delighted to have you both here because you are you, and because it represents collaboration with the opera. A welcome also to those of you who've come from out of town for the opera and the event. I see several of you in the audience. I'd like to thank the English department and the Townsend Center for their support of this event, and also Amy Lee and Caverly Carey for their invaluable assistance with logistics and with publicity. Dolores De Stefano. Dolores, are you here? Dolores is there, who is the Assistant Director of Education at the San Francisco Opera, has helped to make this event possible. So special welcome to you. We'll talk for about an hour, then take questions from all of you with a handheld mic, and then there'll be a reception down the hall to which you're all invited, and at which Jake and Gene will be happy to talk further. Jake Heggie is the composer of the operas Dead Man Walking, The End of the Affair, At the Statue of Venus, To Hell and Back, and Moby-Dick, as well as more than 200 art songs and chamber and concert works. Gene Scheer has worked as librettist on the operas Thérèse Raquin and An American Tragedy, both with composer Tobias Picker, who also did a setting of Melville's Encantadas, where John Gielgud reads the narration. And Gene Scheer has collaborated with Jake Heggie on a number of projects, including Moby-Dick, For a Look or a Touch, Last Acts, To Hell and Back. He is also a composer himself, and as I'm sure we'll find out today when they collaborated on Moby-Dick, they both brought their expertise to the libretto and the score. Robert K. Wallace, who's next in line, is Regents Professor of English at Northern Kentucky University. He's a leading scholar and critic of Melville and the arts. His books include Melville and Turner, Spheres of Love and Fright, and also Frank Stella's Moby-Dick, Words and Shapes, which I believe sold out very quickly, a rare thing for an academic book. He has a book coming out this April 2013, on Heggie and Scheer's Moby-Dick opera, on its creation and first production, filled with photographs by Karen Almond. Karen is here, who's a Dallas opera photographer there in the back. Lots of photographs by Karen Almond and reproductions of the libretto, in which, with revisions, additions, changes. So it's a great chance to see the genesis of the opera. We have flyers here about the book at the end of the table if you're interested, detailing its contents and ordering information. John Kapusta, who's just to my left, is writing his dissertation in the Berkeley Music Department. He's a musicologist. He's writing on vocal style and technique in opera at various moments in history, and he has very recent acquaintance with the opera. I was lucky enough to see the production in San Diego and also a dress rehearsal on Sunday. I'd like to begin, since I've seen the opera, by congratulating you both. It's a major achievement. As the person I live with, who's also in the audience, could testify, I have seen many translations of Moby-Dick in many different art forms, and this seems to me one of the most interesting and successful. So congratulations to you both. And I'd like to begin by asking you about something that came up in interviews with both of you over the past few years. And I do realize that the Moby-Dick opera is new to San Francisco. It's clearly not new to both of you, who've been living with it for many years, significantly before, I'm sure, the 2010 opening. But in interviews over the past couple of years with both of you, you've said some version of comments that the book Moby-Dick was operatic. So I'd like to begin by asking you what you mean by that, in what sense the book you found to be operatic, and in what sense not.
You want to start or shall I? You go ahead. Okay. Well, when Jake came to me with this idea, and he'll talk to you all about how that happened, and I reread the book. I hadn't read it since school. It sort of seemed to be a conflation of wonderful things that opera sort of excels at. It has incredible language, incredible characters, these huge, iconic, sort of existential themes that are at the core of the story. Now, opera does big well. There's a slogan right now on the for the new Metropolitan Opera season. There's a banner on all the buses in New York. It says, "Live big, come to the Metropolitan Opera." And Moby-Dick is sort of along those lines. It's something that that music can sort of access these sort of larger themes, and I'll be happy to talk about that some more. But has all of these aspects, and then it's woven through this incredible story of conflict. I mean, you want something that reaches to larger, sort of huge themes that music can then illuminate. But you also want a real story of conflict, because you want to watch a story sort of transpire in real time, that's what I call it, where there's something at stake in the scenes, where there's something that people want, some obstacles that they're facing, and so that these larger themes are playing out through a very personal story. One of the things I love about it, and I think one of the things that works so well as an opera, is it works sort of on the macro and on the micro. There's these, there's Ahab's quest to sort of control the universe, his vain attempt to do that, and there's also these very intimate moments in which other aspects of the human condition are explored. So I think those are among the things that attracted to me and maybe made it seem operatic. And then the biggest thing is that, why write an opera based on this? We have to believe, and we did, that music could explore these themes, the themes I'm describing, in new, interesting ways. It's not a question of doing it obviously better than the book. That's silly. It's a question of exploring aspects of the human condition that Melville so brilliantly explores through music. And so that's what sort of, that's my short version.
And for me, I'd say, in addition to what Gene said, the book itself feels musical. I mean, there is great music in those pages. There is great theater in those pages. Melville himself had just come to know a lot of Shakespeare just before this, and the biblical reference. He had epic, big, and theatrical in mind. And what we get are these, like Gene said, this vast landscape of big existential themes, but these wonderful intimate journeys that are very, very clear characters and emotional transformations that are so big it makes sense to sing. In other words, they're so big that there is more to say than just what words can convey. And I felt that right from the beginning. The minute it was suggested as an opera, one of my meters for knowing if a project is right for me, whether it's poetry, an operatic story, song cycle, whatever it's going to be, is do I feel music immediately? And when someone said, when the idea came up and it was Moby-Dick, zing. I mean, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up and I started hearing music. It wasn't necessarily the music that was down the road, but it was, the idea that this is an operatic tale. It made sense to put it in an opera house and to fill the stage. In fact, early on, I became convinced this might be one of the most successful incarnations for the book in translation to a different format, because you have the three-dimensional experience for the audience of seeing real people go through these things. Plus, time can stop to tell a story with music in an opera house. It's what you want. Plus, the conflicts are so immense and clear, and the resolution sometimes not so clear. You know, there are a lot of questions unanswered too. So it just struck me right away that it was an opera waiting to emerge. And I guess a lot of other composers have felt that way too, because there have been a lot of attempts over time.
And a lot of balked and partial attempts.
Right, right. But it just felt like the timing was very, very good on many levels.
Can you give an example of a scene where, and describe what music brought to that scene or what music brought to the text? I was struck in your answer by your talking about the opportunity in translating Moby-Dick to opera for music to deepen a scene. So I'm wondering. You know,
I mean, one of the things that people reading Moby-Dick for the first time have trouble with is the narrative goes like this, but the book goes like this. And so what we could do in setting up in a theatrical way is all you have to do is one look or gesture towards something, and it's something that would inspire a writer or later someone's imagination to do this, even though we're still continuing with the journey and keeping the action, the narrative going. And I would say that any number of scenes in the opera where the music brings us to an emotional level. In the book, Melville will describe what was going on, how people were acting, you know, what their response was, what it did inside of them. We can do that with a turn of a phrase. I'm trying to think of a specific example.
Might be the musket scene.
The musket scene?
Playing,
okay.
Which follows the book so closely.
Sure.
And music adds so much to it.
And also shows how Gene so brilliantly distilled a big chunk of Melville into a few essential lines, which was, of course, the biggest challenge.
Well, just one thing to add before reading this is that, you know, people say the challenge here is to take a narrative art form and translate it into a theatrical active art form. And I was saying the other day that, you know, it doesn't mean that there's no narrator, the narrative voice is lost. There is always a narrative voice in opera. The voice is the voice of the composer, who is weaving the emotional journey and giving people the information that the narrator in the novel does, but it's he or she is giving it to them in a different way, and that's what's so interesting about it. So you take a scene like I'm just about to read, and then what Jake does so brilliantly is translated into music, and it's not a question of it being the same. It's a question of it being, in fact, the difference. The riff on it is it's what makes it so interesting to me, and so it's good.
So this scene that he's going to read is, he knew right from the start that this was going to be the end of Act 1. And this is the musket scene from the book, chapter 123. And you can tell them how you set it up and built up to it if you want. In the opera, and in the book, there's a scene in which Starbuck goes into Ahab's cabin. For those of you who know the book well, you'll see that the storyline has actually been fiddled with somewhat, but it's more a question of conflating things than just creating them. But in this scene, which happens in the book, he goes into Ahab's cabin. Ahab pulls a gun on him, and now later in the story, Starbuck, who has been resisting, the only person on the Pequot who's been resisting Ahab's crazy maniacal quest, goes back into the cabin, and lo and behold, he discovers that Ahab is asleep, and that musket is loaded, and he can pick up that gun, and he can, with a touch of his finger, you know, end this maniacal quest, and hopefully go home and see his child and his wife again. And yet he's a Quaker, and he struggles with the religious implications of that. And it's a beautiful sort of like to be or not to be moment where you watch a character who, this is what I loved about it and what attracted me to it, is this, you're looking for moments on stage where a person has to make a decision, and that decision, how they do it, whether they avoid the decision or they make it one way or the other, defines their transformative journey. It defines who they are, who they want to be, and who they're unable to be. And that's what happens so beautifully in this. So I thought we would read this and then play Jake's beautiful music. I'm just going to read a page and a half of it for you. Ere knocking at his stateroom, he involuntarily paused before it a moment.
The cabin lamp, taking long swings this way and that, was burning fitfully and casting fitful shadows upon the old man's bolted door, a thin one, with fixed blinds inserted in place of upper panels. The isolated subterraneousness of the cabin made a certain humming silence to reign there, though it was hooped round by all the roar of the elements. The loaded muskets in the rack were shiningly revealed as they stood upright against the forward bulkhead. Starbuck was an honest, upright man, but out of Starbuck's heart at that instant, when he saw the muskets, there strangely evolved an evil thought, but so blent with its neutral or good accompaniments that for the instant he hardly knew it for itself. "He would have shot me once," he murmured. "Yes, there's the very musket that he pointed at me. The one with the studded stock. Let me touch it, lift it. Strange that I, who have handled so many deadly lances, strange that I should shake so now, loaded. I must see eye, and powder in the pan. That's not good. Best spill it? Wait, I'll cure myself of this. I'll hold the musket boldly while I think. I come to report a fair wind to him, but how fair? Fair for death and doom? That's fair for Moby-Dick. It's a fair wind that's only fair for that accursed fish. The very tube he pointed at me, this very one, this one. I hold it here. He would have killed me with the very thing I handle now. Aye, would he fain kill all his crew? Does he not say he will not strike his spars to any gale? Has he not dashed his heavenly quadrant? And in these same perilous seas gropes he not his way by mere dead reckoning of the error-abounding log? Maybe sit down. If then he were in this instant put aside, that crime would not be his. Ha! Is he muttering in his sleep? Yes, just there. In there he's sleeping, aye, but still alive and soon awake again. I can't withstand thee, old man. Not reasoning, not remonstrance, not entreaty wilt thou hearken to. All this thou scornest. Flat obedience to thine own flat commands. This is all thou breathest. Aye, and sayest the men have vowed thy vow. Sayest all of us are Ahabs. Great God forbid. But is there no other way? No lawful way, make him a prisoner to be taken home. What? Hope to wrest this old man's living power from his own living hands? Only a fool would try it. Say he were pinioned, even knotted all over with ropes and hawsers, chained down to ring bolts on the cabin floor, he would be more hideous than a caged tiger. Then I could not endure the sight, could not possibly fly his howlings. All comfort, sleep itself, inestimable reason would leave me on the long, intolerable voyage. What then remains? The land is hundreds of leagues away and locked Japan the nearest. I stand alone here upon an open sea, with 2 oceans and a whole continent between me and law. Aye, 'tis so. Is heaven a murderer when its lightning strikes a would-be murderer in his bed, tindering sheets and skin together? And would I be a murderer then, if, and slowly, stealthily, and half sideways looking, he placed the loaded musket's end against the door?
That's enough.
That's enough.
Yeah.
Just let me read 3 more lines, because this is the end of it. Sorry. On this level, Ahab's hammock swings within his head this way. A touch, and Starbuck may survive to hug his wife and child again. Oh, Mary, Mary, boy, boy, boy. Great God, where art thou?
And before we hear the excerpt from the opera, Gene, could you just talk a bit about, faced with that text, working on the libretto, literally what you did? Did you take a pen and cross outlines? Did you?
This more than anything in the libretto, this scene you're about to hear is straight from the book. It's just a question of cutting and just distilling, or just really cutting it down to lines, and also lines with Jake then played with, and he has this text in front of him too. So it's he's fiddling with this. Once the idea was to use the scene as the end, and then I wrote a draft based on cutting it down. Then Jake would find from what I put together and what he put together, what worked. So it's a collaborative effort to do it. But in this case, more than anything, this scene
But
is
it's also,
from the book.
It's a matter of, part of the job of a libretto, big part of a job, is to inspire music. And it's not ready until it does inspire music.
Right.
And so when the music starts leading, and I have to follow the music, then it gets cut down even more. And you can tell, if I had set that word for word, that would be probably 30, 40 minutes.
Right.
You know? It takes a lot longer to sing something than it does to say it. That's why you have to be very, very specific with your choices. And I always knew that there was a wonderful opera there. The big job would be distilling that book from however many pages down to basically a 60-page libretto. And that, that would be the Herculean task. Writing the score was going to be Herculean in a different way, but I knew the music was there. So the way we work, Gene would pick these things out and send things to me, and I would send it back, and we'd go back and forth. And then once the music started, it would evolve again. And there were a couple places, too, where music would give us information about a situation or a character that we didn't have before. That suddenly the score was giving information because their hearts were opening up to us. And so we'd have to go and rethink entire scenes or the flow of scenes. Anyway, so this is this scene where in the book, Starbuck is standing outside the door. In our opera, he enters the room, and he's with Ahab, who is sound asleep, with his false leg propped next to him and the musket leaning against the bed. And Starbuck is covered with blood, and he's all sweaty because he's just helped render the oil from a whale up on the deck of the stage. And he's there to confront Ahab about what's going on. So hopefully this will work.
I must speak with you, sir. He is sleeping. He would have shot me. There's the very musket he pointed at me, loaded. I, and powder in the pan. He would have killed me with the very thing in my Oh, Or is it murder to strike a would-be murderer in his bed? Oh Lord, what shall I do? One touch and Starbuck may survive to see his wife and the child again. Return to them Oh, Mary, oh, my boy, great God, where art
I wonder if you both could talk some more about the kinds of choices you made in moving from book to opera. Hearing that scene again and seeing it on stage confirms my sense, this is going to sound a little odd, but that the opera makes Moby-Dick a better novel than it is. By that I mean, we would expect from a novel, and certainly when I teach Moby-Dick, the students who are reading it for the first time often expect sustained character development, a tighter plot, a clear unfolding of the interactions between characters, the action moving at a reasonable clip. And anyone who knows the book well smiles in the opera when probably 12 or 13 minutes in, Ahab is nailing the doubloon to the mast. That is chapter 36 in the book. So obviously, I'm not saying that Moby-Dick isn't an interesting novel, but the opera makes it, the opera finds in the book or responds to the book by creating a much more tightly constructed and fully developed novel. So that's just a digressive way, I guess that's appropriate, a digressive way of asking you both about the kinds of choices you made in moving from book to opera.
We have to remember, if Wagner had known about Moby-Dick, he would have made 3 operas from that. Sorry, but it was a different aesthetic then, too. You know, people wanted an entire day or night in the opera. You know, we didn't have television or movies or computers, and we live in a different era now. And and we also have pragmatic considerations in the opera house, like union contracts. 3 hours, if you go over 3 hours, you run into overtime and issues that an opera company has to think about. I mean, this is all very pragmatic stuff for our time. But we also, if you can tell a story like Moby-Dick, or the essence of it, in under 3 hours, that's a real feat. So, I mean, that was our challenge from the beginning, and one that we embraced. I'm a two-act composer. I like the two-act form, one intermission to sort of gather yourself and then go back into the world. I think 3 acts is too long for people these days. In fact, a lot of 3 or 4 act operas, they're condensing into two acts, so there's only one intermission. Also considering, you know, union expenses and orchestra time and hall time. So all of that has to be considered even going into the project. But that was part of the excitement for me, was that we were going to have to cut and slash ruthlessly all brilliant material to come up with something that it was inspired by Melville, but didn't try to put the book on the stage.
Yeah, that's true. The other thing is, I do feel that since we're changing form, even though it's true, I condensed it to the more dramatic circumstances. The relationships are more defined because they're not, because if you just read the scene I just read to you, which is just played, is a very dramatic scene, but of course it's contextualized, it's surrounded by, you know, cetology and all of these other things that Melville is brilliantly weaving in. But I guess my feeling is that the music is riffing in different directions, so it's accessing the emotional terrain that the novel explores, but it's doing it differently. It's doing it through music, because when you're reading the novel, you're not, even though it's musical language, you're not hearing, you know, music, which is accessing different emotions, different, you know, sort of non-linear feelings. That's what music does. It's not necessarily, so the nonlinear aspect of the novel is really being handled by the composer, and it's in terms of the aesthetic experience of the operatic experience in the house. So that even though it is true that it's distilled into the more dramatic scenes, or and the relationships are probably more, I wouldn't say they're more defined than in the book. It's just that, you know, it's cut. There's the great line by Hitchcock, movies are just like real life with all the boring parts taken out. So I don't think they're boring parts, but they are, actually, funnily enough, the stuff that I love the most right now after reading this 11 times is the cetology, and those are my favorite chapters now. But I do think that what they accomplish in the book is accomplished in the opera, but it's done, you're getting it sort of viscerally through the music. So I think it's all.
And our whole premise for how we were going to do this on the stage was, instead of the first line being "Call me Ishmael," it's the last line. So in other words, we're watching the transformation and the creation of this character who's going to call himself Ishmael, and years later will write the book about the events that he saw, but with an author's and a poet's imagination. So things that maybe he observed just out of the corner of his eye, or maybe it's really interesting during the symphony chapter, which is one of my favorites, and it's a beautiful scene in the opera. Greenhorn, who we call him through the opera, who's going to be Ishmael, is up in the masthead. So he's actually observing, you know, but he's ever present throughout. So events that happen to him or that he feels, he will become the author that will write all these things down and explore and expand. That gave us tremendous freedom to rearrange things and redo things, and I think that was a real keystone for us.
And that was
Yeah.
definitely what we were going for,
Yeah.
and the sense that this young kid, who is the kid he's describing when in the first chapter, in Loomings, in the first chapter, goes on this incredible journey. I like the idea of all these different characters offering different ways of negotiating one's life. You know, Starbuck with the religious way, and Stubb laughing through life, and Flask just sort of like, you know, watching TV basically, and then Queequeg is poised. He's the one person who's like poised between Starbuck's rigidity and Ahab's madness. You have this teacher, this sort of spiritual teacher at the core. That's how I sort of read the book, and it seemed the profitable way to do it, and it was certainly profitable for the opera. So I like that was certainly our point of departure. It's the education of this young man, this lost. You know, it's from the book. He's the only kid. He's the only person on the boat who's never been on a whaler. So it was the idea that he's having this education that starts with him you know, following coffin, going to coffin warehouses and following funeral processions, and winding up the one sort of survivor of this adventure.
I was wondering if I could ask about how the bigness and grandness of Moby-Dick that you've both referenced contributed to the musical compositional process. My impression is that this is a grander project than you've taken on before in terms of operatic projects. And I was wondering whether that idea of writing a sort of grand opera affected how you thought about the vocal parts, perhaps in the scene that we've just seen, but also thinking about your choice to cast the different characters in voice types that we're familiar with, the captain as the heroic tenor, and the perhaps more romantic tenor with Greenhorn and the other vocal parts.
Well, it's interesting because with vocal casting, a lot of people at the beginning said, you know, of course, Ahab's going to be a bass baritone. And we said, why? And he goes, well, he's evil, right? I mean, it's a bass baritone, right? And was like, well, is he evil? I mean, he's complicated. He's damaged goods, that's for sure. But he's also an inspired leader. And he's the kind of person whose voice needs to sail over everyone else. So he can not only convey his message, but draw them in. And that's a heroic tenor. And not in the sense of, you know, I was thinking of it as a big lyric tenor. Someone who can sing Lohengrin or Peter Grimes are really the examples. I never thought of it as someone who also sings Siegfried, but it's turned out to be that way. But you know, great. They all bring something wonderful to it, and there's a lot of tenors very interested in singing that role because it is so complicated and interesting. And but that was actually pretty clear to me right from the beginning, and also having the pants role of Pip be a soprano and have it be a pants role.
What led to that choice?
Well, you've got this huge men's chorus, all these huge Wagnerian-sized voice characters, you know, on stage. If you were to actually cast a young boy, you would get into miking. And then you would also get into the unreliability of a young boy and a young boy's voice. And then you'd get into miking everybody. It just turns into a mess.
Also,
and
the complexity of the character. I
Right.
just think it's such a deep character,
Yeah.
it's such an important character in the book.
To trust
and to just for a kid to do it in an opera.
No way.
It would just be very, very hard. It's one thing to have a child run on and if a kid's playing like an innocent, but this is a person who goes mad, who's lost at sea, and
Right.
and
has to sing high Ds.
has to sing high Ds, and all the musical considerations having to sail and
what I
everything.
loved about it was too that it opened up the whole vocal range too, having that one female voice. And you really, and also part of the thing you think of with vocal casting is you want to be able to recognize those characters orally, instantly, not just visually. And so we always know when Pip is singing.
Right.
You know, there is no question that it's anyone else. And I think it's the same when Ahab sings. I think it's the same when Starbuck sings. And Greenhorn, they're all very different kinds of voices. And it was also thinking of the pairing. So we have Ahab, who's, a big lyric tenor. And his foil throughout is Starbuck. So it made sense to have a baritone. Greenhorn was definitely going to be a light lyric tenor. And his foil is Queequeg. We didn't have a bass baritone in the cast, so it made sense that Queequeg would be the bass baritone, very grounded, rich, beautiful sound. And then Flask and Stubb are sort of paired, so we have baritone and tenor there again. And then the offstage captain, Gardner from the Rachel, I thought being practical that this could be someone who also covers Starbuck. So it could be, and since the captain of the Pequod is a tenor, the captain of the Rachel is a baritone. So it was just always thinking in terms of what is the dynamic, what defines the character well, what range voice and what color especially when they have a lot of scenes together, you know. So that was a part of it. What was the other part of your question? Because you had a big question.
Well, I was just generally interested in how that by incorporate or having so many characters and casting them.
Oh, grandness.
That's right. It certainly contributed.
Well, I think also part of that was the Dallas Opera, when they called, they were building a brand new American opera house. I mean, and the entire community was participating in this. Huge, huge project. Building an opera house in this day and age in the United States of America is remarkable. And it's red, okay? They wanted bold. They were making a statement. So, I mean, what bigger statement could you make operatically than Moby-Dick? And the good thing about it was, again, it wasn't people going, well, what is that? Everyone had a familiarity with Moby-Dick, which is a great asset for the story. It was always, how the hell are you going to do that? You know, that was always a big question, and we wondered that too. We worked with our director, Leonard Folia, constantly. He was our dramaturg, and he always said, though, if the scene is right, you guys just write it, I'll figure out how to stage it. And boy, did he ever. I mean, it's the most innovative, brilliant production. It's just mind-blowing to me, the solutions that they came up with on this relatively simple set that actually is quite complex, and the things they did with lighting and projection and film and technology. I mean, it was an opportunity to do a 21st century opera where we bring three-dimensional computer graphics and film work, as well as spectacular lighting and flying and rigging and really using the whole space. It was a very, very exciting project right from the start. And so we were thinking grand from the beginning because it was the opening of a house, it was Moby-Dick, and we knew I wanted to use the big orchestra. So the original orchestra had 75 pieces, 40 men in the chorus, 8 characters, you know, that's a grand opera. So, you know, it was, and I think, you know, the bigger the message, the bigger the announcement, the more excitement is generated, the bigger the news, right? And the more excited people are about, or curious at least, about what's going to happen, you know? And I thought that was what the project needed too. Yeah.
I'd like to return to Sam's idea of improving upon the novel. I mean, one of the very difficult things for those of you who know the novel who haven't seen the opera yet is that they had to eliminate those wonderful chapters on land. So there's nothing in the Spouter Inn, in Bed Together, Mapple's sermon, all the stuff that Moby-Dick always begins with isn't there because they had to cut it to get under 3 hours. On the other hand, to kind of make up for that, they created a relationship between Greenhorn, Ishmael's name before he says, call me Ishmael, in the novel, between Greenhorn and Queequeg that develops on the ship. And when you're teaching the novel, it's one of the most difficult things about the story, that students get deeply invested in this relationship between the two characters in New Bedford. But then once you get on Ahab's ship, there are only a couple chapters where you have it. So it's an emotional downer for people who, you know, really, it's a great relationship. So, and they had to cut out where that relationship was created in the novel and create in the libretto and then in the music written for the two characters the equivalent of it in the opera so that you do get it on the shipboard. And could you talk about inventing scenes that are not in the book? Because none of those are in the book where they're together on the boat.
It's interesting. That opening scene in which they get together, it is a creation of mine to do it that way, but it's
You were so excited about it.
Yeah,
I remember you talking about
yeah,
it.
I was excited about it, but it actually, there's an echo from a chapter in the book, the Ramadan chapter. You know, there is a chapter where Queequeg is praying and Ishmael is wondering, what in hell are you doing, you know? And so I use that as a sort of a springboard to announce their relationship. That there's a moment of conflict, which we're always looking for, which defines, you know, who these people are and how they handle that conflict. And it's actually the way in which Queequeg handles that conflict is so rooted, so, you know, grounded, that it seemed like a really good way to kick off their relationship. And also too, again, it is true, it doesn't happen on the book, but, you know, in Loomings, a lot of the language in the beginning of what Greenhorn says is from the book, The November in My Soul and such, and coffin warehouses. This is woven into the text, and it's conflated with this Ramadan chapter in this new sort of scene. And then I found this Samoan chant that Jake rewrote music for, that just the text, which you won't know when you're watching the opera. I don't think it's actually necessary to know it, but it's amazingly spiritual. It actually has a sense of it feels more like Arjuna and, you know, in the Bhagavad Gita. That's what it really feels like, which I actually feel a lot for when I'm thinking about Queequeg. It feels like that kind of wisdom, that kind of Eastern wisdom. So it was a creation, a way of doing it, and it. You know, what you try to do is you try to create a scene in which these people are coming together, they're learning about each other, the audience is learning about them. In the moment, right, in the moment. Where it's not, no one's telling a story, you're showing it happen. And at the end of it, you want the audience to feel, what happens next? Right. Tell me, what's happening now? And I think that's what the scene, we're trying to accomplish with the scene.
Well, it's also, you want to care about these people. It's very, very important in the theater that you care about the people on the stage. If you have nothing emotionally vested, you're not going to care about what's happening next to them or if they all die, you know, or if they're rescued. I think that's one of the most emotional, we all talked about, that one of the most emotional scenes in the opera is at the very end, after the ship has been wrecked and he's floating, you know, Greenhorn is floating on Queequeg's coffin. And this other captain says, you know, where's your ship? And he says, all gone, all lost. And one of the lines he also says is, I'm here, you know, which was something that he couldn't say at the beginning of the opera. He goes from saying, I don't know who I am, I don't know where I am, and at the end when he's being rescued, I'm here, I'm here. I find that an incredibly emotional journey. But, you know, it's interesting, Bob, because it wasn't necessarily an obvious choice to cut the chapters on land. And this was an idea that came to us through the person who thought of the idea originally, Terrence McNally. He said the whole thing should be set at sea. I mean, in operas, you have a finite number of minutes on stage. You have just so much vocal stuff you can count on. And also, you have an audience's interest. If you're moving from land, if you're constantly moving location, it can be very confusing, whereas if you have a defined location right from the start, this is where everything's going to unfold. People will go with you. You know, if you're uncertain as a creative team, you know, moving back and forth, it can really weaken the plot. So I just thought it was brilliant what Gene did, was taking the essence of what happened in those chapters and putting it in the first 5 minutes of the actual action on the stage. So we actually don't miss those stages. And the thing is, Father Mapple's sermon is amazing in the book, but we know what he's going to say. There isn't a surprise for us in that. The beauty of it in the chapter in the book is the gorgeous language and the power and the passion and how it infuses the characters. But if we were to do that on the stage, within a couple of minutes, you'd be like, I already know what he's going to say. There's no surprise.
It would wind up being a musical cliche.
Right.
Because
so it's a matter of like, where are you going to slash and cut? And how can you conflate these things so that they still are represented, the important moments, but you know, like Gene said, one thing leads to another thought. You're going from thought to thought. You find out what people want. What does this person want? What does this person want? And why are they in each other's way? That's what's interesting about Ahab and Starbuck. They both want different things, and they can't get them, you know? And Ahab keeps pushing Starbuck away because he manages to get the whole ship to want what he wants. I find that all terribly fascinating, interesting, dramatic, musical, theatrical. It was really, I mean, writing this opera, I have to say, every single day was such an amazing privilege. I mean, we would be talking to each other on the phone going, we are getting paid to write an opera on Moby-Dick. It's like, this will not be all of our lives. It will be this moment. Right. And we were kind of each on fire with it because we were so excited about it.
And it is a understatement of all. It is a masterpiece. It is. I mean, the book is a the book is a masterpiece, right. And to get to spend that much time with it is really a privilege because it's. He was 31 when he wrote this, guys. He was like 31 years old. It's just
amazing.
What a moment.
Which is exactly how old Stephen Costello is, who becomes Ishmael. He's 31 years old, right? Yeah.
Jake, you talked before in answer to John's question about the grandness of the opera. And my understanding is that it was co-commissioned by a series of international opera companies. Yes. And I'm wondering what difference, if any, that made in the composition process. That is, did you imagine an international audience? Did you feel any kind of pressure as well as zeal about the grandness?
I didn't. The only pressure I felt was our biggest concern was that this guy and this guy, the Melville scholars would be so appalled by what we did that they would literally be like hitting us with this book, you know, how could you, how dare you? And they've turned out to be some of our biggest supporters. It's like so amazing. So that was the pressure that we felt, was how are we going to really honor Melville? How are we going to do this story justice? The international consortium that commissioned it, which was Dallas State Opera of South Australia, Calgary Opera, San Diego Opera, and San Francisco Opera, that gave tremendous confidence. I mean, unbelievable confidence that this many people believed in us and our ability to translate this into something meaningful for the opera stage. Also then the confidence of these great singers who signed on before a note or a word had been written. A great director and production team also right with us. It was so empowering, which is why the only terrifying time in my journey was when I had written for 6 months and I basically threw it all away because I still didn't have the character of Ahab. But once I found that, then I wrote very quickly. But that was the only terrifying part, was when all of a sudden I started doubting myself, thinking, how can I really do this? I also felt my musical language shifting throughout this because it demanded that, like you were saying, these bigger lyrical lines. I felt sort of a Verdian, Wagnerian influence, as well as this very bizarre sort of Philip Glass influence, which I had never felt or thought I would feel in my work. I mean, I admire Philip so much, but I never thought that would be part of my musical language. And, you know, Britten and Poulenc and Debussy and Bernstein and Sondheim have always been there, but these other influences started suddenly appearing, but it felt so right. And then I just stopped and listened. And I have to say, because you teach Emily Dickinson as well, I feel this sometimes when I'm in that zone and I'm just listening and absorbing and writing and not thinking about it. I feel, even though it might sound a little arrogant, it's very emotional though, because I feel like I understand a little bit of what they were going through, just trying to get this out, and that feeling of sort of being on fire with a creative spirit where you can barely write fast enough to get it down, and you just hope that it does justice to what you're trying to do. And so this closeness to the spirit of it, I think we both felt at some, you know, during it as well, which was also very moving. It was a terribly emotional journey. It continues to be. Yeah.
Jake, when you said you did 6 months of work and you discarded it, was it because...
I held on. I've still got it. So.
Yeah. Was it because the music wasn't working with the libretto, or there were scenes from the book that you ended up discarding? I guess I have two questions. What did you put aside? And also, I've read that it was the Ahab's aria about the white and turbid wake that was pivotal. What about that enabled you to go on and write the score?
All the characters felt very real to me except Ahab. I still had him sort of pigeonholed in my head too. Not as a bass baritone, but as, you know, a villainous character. He was not fully formed individual for me, whereas every other character felt very real, felt multidimensional. I knew I could go for a walk outside of the libretto or the book with them on the beach and have a discussion, and still, you know, feel their music. But Ahab was elusive to me, and, you know, as Gene said, you can't have Hamlet without Hamlet, and you can't have Moby-Dick without Ahab, and so I kept trying to write organically straight through, which is what I like to do from beginning straight through, and it just wasn't working. And so I saw that monologue that Gene had put in the middle of Act 1, I leave a white and turbid wake, and I thought, I think I know how that goes. And I went there and just started writing, and I wrote that whole scene, and suddenly Ahab was this fully formed individual with this literally big, huge heart and this deep ache inside of him, so aware of how he had lost touch with the world and that there was nothing beautiful for him anymore. And that's a person I could understand. I could relate to that aching individual and how he had been changed by this physical incident. And then once I found that, I went to the beginning and wrote straight through. It became very clear because suddenly everybody was there and the whole world of the opera sort of opened up musically. Yeah.
Did knowing the individual singers for whom you were composing contribute to your process?
Absolutely, for both of us. Knowing who you're writing for is so key. It's not that you're writing only so that they can sing it, it's that you are aware of their gifts, and it's actually quite liberating because it is a visual art form as well as an oral one. And so being able to picture it clearly and for me to think of it orally clearly, I'm not going to write it just for that singer. I'm writing it for the role, but I'm going to dress it on that singer for the first time. And so it's sort of like one of my next projects is I'm writing an opera for Joyce DiDonato, who's not only one of the greatest singers of our time, but also a great friend. And I know her very, very well. The roles that I've written and songs I've written for Frederica von Stade, lots of people sing them. But knowing that I was writing it for her made the piece much more successful and actually freed me to write better. You know? I think creative artists do that for each other. They challenge each other in ways, you know? I think Gene makes me write better, you know, by what he brings to the table, you know?
Gene, did you say that you had read the book 11 times?
Yeah.
I just wanted to confirm that for the recording. And I also heard you say that the cetological chapters, there's one called cetology, but there's an array of chapters about lines on whale ships, the whale's tail, the whale's forehead.
The baby whale, the pods of whales that they find.
The Grand Armada chapter.
Grand Armada chapter, yeah.
What about those chapters? Appeals to you? And I guess it comes back to the original question I asked about what you both chose to represent on stage and what you chose not to and why. I'm just wondering, I mean, those chapters are connected with the narrative, but they're not chapters directly tied to character development or to the advance of the plot. They exist at some oblique or circuitous or intricate relation to the plot. So I guess it's two questions. What interests you about those chapters? I too am quite fascinated by them. And would that just be a different kind of opera? And I just want to make clear to Jake that I wasn't asking for Wagner's version of Moby-Dick.
I think that, you know, the storyline of this, like the storyline of one's life, is informed by so many different things. And what I loved about all of these riffs, it was almost like a jazz composer was writing the novel. You know, it goes off in all these different directions. But what I like about it is that it calls to mind, to me anyway, this notion that all of our lives are the result of many tributaries sort of flowing into the stream of your life and creating the narrative and who you are as a human being. And I think when you're out on a whale ship for 4 years, up to 9 years, some of them these voyages took, but certainly 2.5. I know when the Essex went out, it went out for 2.5 years, and they were provisioned for 2.5 years. So that I think that all of these things, the knowledge of all of these things, and the world of all these things are the things that come together to inform who you are. So it might seem like static in the book if you're not sort of in the zone of reading it, but I think it's almost like the overtones in a chord. These chapters are filling out the harmony that is underscoring the melodic line, which is the narrative line of the book. And that's how I feel. That's how I feel about it. So when he goes and he sees in the Grand Armada chapter, when he sees these, after you're trying to kill all these whales, and you see all these whales giving birth, and it's something quite magnificent. Also, when he was writing this book, he was writing it on a table, not on a desk, as I understand it. And he had books, many books that from whaling history and stacked all around him. He was getting them from the libraries and so forth. Scoresby, I think, was one, and all these other ones. And so, and there are chapters, or I should say paragraphs, from these books that found their way into Moby-Dick, sifted through Melville's imagination. So it's all of these things that are, our lives are complicated, and we're focusing on what we're doing, but it's informed by all of these other things. And I think, to me, that's what this is so beautiful about these chapters. It feels, like I said, it sort of fills in the harmony. I never said it like that, but that's sort of how I feel about it.
You two spent so long figuring out how to transform this book that would work in a totally different medium. the words and the notes and the grandeur that you felt. But then at some point you had to turn it over to performers, and I'm wondering if you pretty much imagined how it was going to be on stage, or if you learned new things about your creation by hearing it performed.
You learn new things.
Yeah.
You learn. That's one of the glories of doing what we do. You know, the librettist is sort of like the first link in the chain, and then of course it goes through the composer who carries it all the way through. But the beautiful thing about what we do is it is such a collaborative art form, and the beautiful we have not just our imaginations, but all these incredible imaginations. I often say that, you know, if you do your job right, everyone feels like they own the piece. The librettist writes the words, then it goes to the composer, and then the composer just absorbs it, and it gives it to the conductor and the director, and then when it gets to the singers, you have the benefit of all these incredible imaginations, particularly with the people we've been blessed to work with. And so at the end of the day, is it different? Yes, it's different. It's very different. I didn't see how they were going to do these things.
Couldn't have imagined.
Couldn't have imagined it. I will say this, I had a default staging. I had a set in my head as I was, and I can tell you, I'm not going to, but I had a set in my head because, you know, that's just, I needed that as a sort of scaffolding. But it's incredible to see what these people do, even the way they inflect a word. I mean, Stephen Costello, who plays Greenhorn, he's just, the way he just, it's not even when it's when he pauses. Mm-hmm. It's just, it's so beautiful.
Well, because they bring their whole life experience to what they sing too. And you're never more vulnerable or naked, I think, than when you're singing. And you can tell a lot about a person from when they sing. And all these people bring their life experience to it, and they bring new levels too. I find new things. I mean, just watching J. Hunter Morris last night, it's a totally different Ahab than Ben Heppner, and terrifying. He was like a fire-breathing, ferocious Ahab. Just amazing. I don't know how he gets through it vocally, because he does this growl in his throat, but he still sings with this clarion voice. It was just, you know, it gives even more information about the character in a different way. So yeah, we learn more about it every time. You know, I'd love to know is you as Melville scholars, why does this, I mean, did it terrify you thinking about this happening? And what about it, what about it, and what about it has actually been gratifying, and what is not so gratifying?
Hey, we asked the question.
No, but I haven't had the opportunity.
Well, I'm sure we have different answers, and I'm sure people in the audience do, but my answer would be no, not terrifying at all. That is, Moby-Dick, if you'll excuse the expression, is in the air. That is, there's the British big read, a chapter a day. There's Matt Kish, who recently published a book with a drawing for every chapter. There's, and even I don't understand this, there's a Moby-Dick translated into emoticons. The book, I've asked, as I mentioned before, I've seen lots of translations of Moby-Dick into different media, and I've often asked, when the artists have been living and I've met them, why do this? And there's a pattern of taking up the challenge the book itself articulates. So at one point, the narrator of the book says, I put the brow of the sperm whale before you, read it if you can. There are 3 chapters about the difficulty of representing whales, which are also about the difficulty of representing the book, of coming to terms with the book. So from my experience reading, teaching, writing about the book, there's a kind of reflexivity about it, so that it's about the process of its own creation, in part. And there's a challenge to the reader, explicitly, redundantly, sometimes hilariously, to interpret it, if you can. So not terrified at all. Interested to see the array of academic critical responses, but also the array of artistic responses. And I'll let Bob answer, but the second part of your question is what worked. And for me, one thing that worked really well was you just see that in the book, there is a compelling novel, the way you two have put it together. It's not in the book in the sense that when you read it, when you teach it, it unfolds the way it unfolded for you both. You've extracted it. You haven't created it out of whole cloth, but you've taken something that's in the book. And what's interesting to me is thinking about why the book isn't written that way. That is, it's willfully, deliberately not written to provide the kinds of satisfactions you both provide. And I don't mean that critically at all. It's just that the opera is satisfying in terms of character interaction, character development. For me, one of the most powerful scenes is the epilogue scene that you both created. It doesn't occur in the book, where the captain of the Captain Gardner of the ship Rachel, who's looking for his lost son at sea, whom he never founds, instead finds Ishmael, and they have a exchange backed up by music. But again, it makes me think, having lived with the book for many years, makes me understand things about the book and what is withheld that you provide, and wonder why it's withheld, and what other kinds of satisfactions or frustrations the author provides. So, Bob, you may have a
I guess I'd give a double answer, too. I mean, there have been so many very interesting adaptations in different forms, visual and dramatic and musical. And I think the first question is it going to succeed in its own terms, in its own genre? And after sitting through that 90-minute first act, there is no, I mean, it's incredible. The experience as a performed artwork is just fantastic. And is it going to succeed in that form and be deeply true to the novel at the same time? Which is absolutely true in this case. I mean, that's what's so amazing. I mean, they had to go, I think, both very deeply into the novel to be able to pull out and make it their own in the way they did in that medium. So I think it's a masterpiece of an adaptation from those points of view. I think what also I find interesting about it is it is so much a work for our time. And that starts off with Queequeg chanting. We don't start with Ishmael, we don't start with Ahab, we start with the Polynesians singing in a language that's not English. This is a global opera from the very beginning. And by making Greenhorn and Queequeg and Pip into a trio whose deep humanity contrasts with the power struggle that Starbuck and Ahab is going through, that's also for our time. This is the world we live in, where we have to be so attentive to the potential, the multicultural potential, to use the buzzword. But the thing is, this makes that so real in the course of the opera. And I think that second relationship between that trio of characters is the future. And that's in Moby-Dick. You know, Ishmael and Queequeg and Pip are there, the poor rover is there, but it's foregrounded in the novel in a way that's not in the book. And a lot of people, you know, who don't know the novel, they think of Ahab and the whale, okay? Well, in this, you've got a little bit of the whale. Yeah. You've got Ahab, but what I find deeply fascinating and satisfying is that, in my mind, experiencing this opera, Ahab is wonderfully done, but he's no more important than Starbuck. But you can't say, I can't say that from reading the novel. I mean, I never thought Starbuck would ever be as powerful as he is here. And I've read the novel 20 times, and he's a great character, but this is...
Yes, he does.
Huh?
You got it.
Well, we weren't
Absolutely.
competing. But, Greenhorn, Ishmael is also... he's not a narrator like Ishmael in the book, but he's a huge character. He's as important as Ahab in this book. He's the one who develops and changes in the opera, I mean. And Queequeg, of course, is the heart of the book in a way, and he's the heart of the opera. And Pip is bigger in the opera than he's foregrounded. So these characters, in my mind, all 5 of them are like equally important. I mean, 5 major characters that are just rich and fully developed, and they are characters of our time that attune us to thoughts and feelings that our culture needs. So when a 3-hour opera can do that and be true to Moby-Dick at the same time, It's pretty wonderful. Yeah.
Jake turning the questions on the questioners seems like a good segue to open it up to all of you to ask questions. So there's a microphone coming around. Caverly, if you'd switch it on. And please leave the microphone on. Raise your hand. You'll get the microphone. When you're finished talking, we'll take it. Yep, go anywhere. Just alternate between the two sides of the room. Is it on?
Thank you very much, everyone, for your comments on the panel. It struck me that at the beginning of the conversation, everybody was talking a bit about what was being left out. And by the end of the conversation, we were talking about what had been added in. And I wonder if actually there might be more to say about the opera, not as a process of leaving out, but as a process of accumulation. And I'm wondering specifically not just about the scenes that are added, but to think about at what part of the process, to break down the process a little bit. You said that you begin with the libretto, you add the music, but of course there's a back and forth. At which point does the technology come in? At which point does the theatricality come in? What is the relationship if it's not linear? I mean, how did it transform the project as you went along? Can you say a little bit more about that kind of process?
I just want to say, before, as Gene has said this before there's words, before there's music, there's a story, right? So that comes first. How are we going to tell the story? What is the story we're telling? And the basic process is we both read the book, internalize the book, and then put it away and forget about it, right? And then you start writing and thinking about characters. What characters are we going to include? We left the Fedallah completely out. And there are a lot of other characters that don't appear at all in the opera, because you have to make hard choices. So that's the first process. And then it's not easy to define. It starts off with us, and then our director, Leonard Folia, came in early on, and he worked as a dramaturg just to make sure we were following lines, because perspective is everything in a project of this size. It's very easy to lose perspective, to fall in love with something, and suddenly you're way off course. And so he helped to give us perspective, the conductor as well. And then it's really working back and forth and finding out what rings true in terms of telling the story and developing these characters for all of us, so that we're all on the same page and we all believe in it.
Yeah, it's definitely true. We had all these other folks who were, the conductor and Leonard, who were essential and wonderful. But the truth is, you're asking about the process of it. It's me and Jake. I mean, really, as it begins, until there's something on the page, there's nothing to respond to, for these other folks. So, we had done a lot of work, and the story was crafted, and then I'll give you one example. Lenny suggested I actually opened Act 2 at one point with the Rachel. I knew I had to have the captain of the Rachel establish he was looking for his lost son. And Lenny suggested moving that scene later and so forth. So that was but the scenes were written, and we would move them around. But in terms of when does the technology come in? It comes in later, because what Jake and I are doing is we are just trying to honestly portray in dramatic terms these scenes, and because with Lenny's encouragement, we didn't limit our imaginations to what could be done, ergo the whale hunt and so forth that takes place in Act 1. And so that's how it was. We're only concerned with, it's just related to the question about the bigness of the novel, and is it hard to I'm not thinking, it's very liberating. This is such a masterpiece that it's not a question of working at, it's like, Shakespeare, honestly. It's like, so I'm not worried about that. I just put it aside and do our work, which is to tell this story in operatic terms. And in order to do that, we have to craft one scene after the other that advances the story, that works sort of on a micro level and a macro level, but in which conflict is happening, which these things are all transpiring. And then the technology, all the wonderful things, it's brilliant what they did, but it comes later. And I'm amazed with what they did, but that was not part of the process.
It almost didn't make it to opening night.
That's another story.
That's another story, but it does come later. But it definitely starts with us. What's the story that we want to tell?
Yeah.
And then gaining perspective as we move along.
I'd like to add something about the collaboration. One of the most exciting things in working on the book was getting to see the manuscripts and the libretto and also the musical manuscripts with the annotations and changes. And there's a lot of that in the book. You're going to be able to see that process underway. And it's back and forth many times on these major speeches and arias, first with the words. And then one of the most interesting things is Jake will be, in one case, writing out the fair copy score. He's got this all figured out. It's ready to go to the printer and whatever, and everything's neat as can be for about 4 staves. And then he gets a new idea and starts writing a new verse to that whole aria down in the right corner of the page, and it changes again. So the music was telling him something new, and that was really interesting to watch for me. Yeah.
Other questions?
Hi, Jake, if I may. You mentioned Wagner once or a couple times before, and multiple times in other interviews. And having been at the performance last night, it was great. I found it slightly reminiscent of the Metropolitan production of The Ring, actually.
This came first.
So then not reminiscent. And I was just curious if you found perhaps the story itself and its epic nature, maybe that was what brought out this Wagner.
I have no idea. I have never been a huge Wagner fan. I like the early Wagner operas like Lohengrin and The Dutchman, and but I have no idea. I just listen, really do. I mean, I think the biggest part of what I do is just showing up and listening, and just listening to the characters and responding and writing it out and trusting. It's one of the most exciting and terrifying parts of the whole thing. But I had also, there isn't a composer since Wagner that hasn't been influenced by him somehow. And I feel like right now it's the same way with Philip Glass. Whether you like Philip Glass or not, he's ubiquitous. He's in movies, in the theater, on television commercials, on the radio. You hear that influence everywhere. I mean, it's amazing. And the same with Wagner. And it's just sort of, it wasn't a deliberate attempt to say, oh, I'm going to write this like Wagner. It's just part of, Sister Helen Prejean calls it your creative crock pot that you carry around with you, and things are just simmering in there, and then at the right time, certain things it just happens. So it wasn't a conscious thought. I think it was the landscape of it, the vastness of it, the bigness of the characters. I mean, these characters are huge and rich and complex, and they require a big musical palette. And then I also think it's where I am in my life developmentally as a composer. I mean, in 10 years, I wrote 4 full-length operas, as well as a lot of one acts, as well as a lot of songs and other music. I mean, writing, and the only way you grow and develop as a composer is by writing a lot, and listening to it perform, seeing what works, what doesn't work, and moving on. And I find listening to what doesn't work even more instructive, And so I really don't have a clear answer to it, except that was the musical world that came to me and unfolded, and that felt really right. Yeah.
We've gotten so much insight into substance. My question is more of an operational nature. I understand that the new Dallas Opera House doesn't have a prompter box. Was that a consideration?
Actually, no. I hate prompter boxes, and we've been lucky enough to work with great artists who also don't want them. I think the only opera that I've done where there was a prompter box was the original production of Dead Man Walking, where Susan Graham was just terrified, and she just insisted on having a prompter box, which wasn't in the initial design at all. But a lot of houses are phasing that out because we have such amazingly well-trained singers, and it does distract. I mean, I understand the need for it for certain singers because it's terrifying. I can't imagine how singers do it. I have such admiration for singers. I think they're some of the bravest people, and their job is so hard to go out in front of thousands of people and trust all of this to work and convey a story, singing some of the most difficult music ever written, you know. But no, it wasn't even in the back of my head to worry about a prompter box. Once again, you know, I mean, our job was to tell this story, you know, as an opera with words and music. And as Lenny Folia and Patrick said to us, if it's right, we'll find a way to stage it, and we'll find the right people to handle it. You know, you should see Patrick down there, though, throwing cues, throwing words. You know, it's pretty amazing. If you can ever see the conductor in an opera like this, because he's like this, and he's like this, and he's like this, and he's like this. That's why opera conductors are so remarkable. And, I mean, the real ones are very rare.
Thank you. Thank you. This has been wonderful. There's a lot of questions. I'm wondering on the question of who is Moby-Dick. What do you think of the interpretation that Moby-Dick is God, the focus of man's vengeance, since Ahab rails against God throughout the opera?
That's a tough one.
I think it's actually quite simple.
I think
I think it's tough.
I think. To me, I think he's the way I distilled it for myself is he is just you can name it God, but he is trying to create order in a world that doesn't have it.
Who?
Ahab is. He's defiantly angry.
But who's the whale?
Who's the whale?
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
That's who's the whale. I think it's a simple answer.
I think the whale is a whale.
It's a whale.
I mean, the whale. I think that's he's been the whale. That's the.
Here first.
Yeah.
I think the whale is a whale, and that's the sad. It's one of the saddest parts of the story. It's just nature. It's just the way the world is.
Right.
The whale is just a whale that's swimming around the ocean.
And the interesting part of the book is what people project onto that whale.
Right.
You know?
And what he does, and what he's projecting onto this is a sense of if I can control this whale, if I can right this wrong, then I will assert control. But it's the beautiful thing about this is that tomorrow I might think something else. That's the brilliance of the book.
Yeah.
But
Sister Helen Prejean, who I got to know really well, working on several projects, including Dead Man Walking, the way she talks about, and this is the way society's work and civilization works, is a great leader to rally his people will identify an enemy to, that's the cause of all their woes, right? You identify the enemy, identify the enemy, dehumanize the enemy, kill the enemy, right? Well, in this, I mean, Ahab has identified something that's already dehumanized, right? It's a whale, it's nature, and he's identified it as evil. So it's already identified. So if he can rally the ship, the entire, his entire troops to go after this as a single mind, it's not different from what great leaders of the past have done, and continue to do.
Hi, I was wondering all last night at the performance how technically you managed Ahab's peg leg and how J. Hunter Morris managed to navigate the stage. He
had a lovely line the other day when we were doing a panel. He just said, there are assets and to this role, and he doesn't concentrate on the difficulties. And one of the difficulties is the peg leg, but he manages it really, really well. And one of the beautiful things about his performance is you don't see, when you're looking in a performer's eye and you can see fear, or you can see that they're dedicating a certain part of their brain to sort of the tasks, the logistical tasks. I don't see any of that in his performance. He's just completely in the moment, and he just chooses not to let it be a challenge. It is a challenge, obviously, but he's quite extraordinary with it.
He told me a story last night at the party afterwards about learning the role. When he first learned it, we'd been in the summer of last year, because he sang it in Australia. And he had just gone through very painful shoulder surgery where they literally had to take take a bone out and replace it. And he was in agonizing, excruciating pain while he was learning this. And he said it put him in the mindset of the character of Ahab, having physically been ripped apart by a whale and managing to survive, but in a period where there wasn't anesthetic, where there wasn't any, anesthesia, any of these things, and to be reminded every step you take of the agony and how compromised you are. And he said learning it really in that way informed how he saw the role and the character. And you can really see him using that leg to an advantage in his portrayal when you go see the opera, or if you've already seen it. He really is a great actor. I mean, he uses it as an asset. Yes, it's hard enough to sing this stuff on two legs. So you can imagine focusing extra energy on balancing on one leg and a peg leg, but he used it to inform the character. There's another great story when we were first writing it, and Ben Heppner was going to create the role. He did create the role of Ahab in the opera in Dallas, and we were in New York, and I was playing through the score for him. And he was very happy and excited, and he's a big man. And I said, so which leg do you think you'll have the peg leg on? And he looked at me and he went, peg leg? He said, I hadn't thought of that.
and not just a peg leg, but in Act 2, he has a peg leg and is elevated above the stage in a cage.
30 feet, yeah, swinging, yeah.
You said, Jake, that you admired and were in awe of what opera singers can accomplish, but you yourself seem to have, interestingly, put them in a position where they have to accomplish that with a peg leg in a cage 30 feet above the stage.
There's another, that was Gene. He did that one. There was and we always knew that scene was going to be part of it too. There was during rehearsals in Dallas, this is another funny story. Stephen Costello kept wearing this hat, and every time he was up in the masthead singing, his hat kept casting a shadow over his face. I couldn't see his face. So I went to Leonard Foley, the director, and I said, you mind if Stephen takes off his hat when he's up there? I want to see his face, And so Lenny went up to Stephen and told him, Jake wants you to take your hat off when you're singing. He goes, but I like my hat. And Lenny said, well, Jake doesn't ask for much, so can you just take the hat off? And Stephen said, whoa, 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 whoa. Jake doesn't ask for much. He said, have you seen my score? Have you seen where I am singing? It's easy to lose touch, I get used to like these amazing singers who are so good. It's like, a lot of them were terrified of singing at these great heights. They sing from way up in the rigging, and Pip, the soprano, sings this one mad scene on a cable 25 feet above the stage, moving across, flailing while singing way up in the stratosphere. I mean, they were so game to embrace it, though. I mean, their first reaction started with F, and, but then, now they've embraced it. They all love it. They really do. It's amazing. Then they're champions at it. If you look at Jonathan Lamalu, when he's Queequeg up there and he's about to faint, up in the masthead, he's hooked in, and he was so terrified at first he couldn't do anything dramatically, and now he basically lets go and like is flailing around there. And it's like, wow, has he changed his course? So I mean, it's like the thing too. You write a role for the best person you can imagine, and you know what? Lots of people appear if it's a good role. And that's what I've learned about writing for opera singers too. If you write a challenging role, but it's well written and it's gratifying and it's well done, all of a sudden lots of people appear who are right for it.
Let's take a couple of more questions, and there were some over here on the right side of the room.
Jake, I'd like to ask kind of a big question. Where do you see the future of opera? As in, what do you find essential in the genre? And what do you think is maybe just an incidental manifestation of it now institutionally in the world or in America?
Well, you can't do opera. You can do opera a lot of ways, but you cannot do it without singers. And what's amazing is we have more gifted, amazing singers than ever, and they keep appearing. Despite the education systems, trying to squelch to keep the arts out of school, for financial reasons. I don't think it's willful. It's financial consideration. They keep appearing more and more and more. They love it. Look at the shows that are on. There's no music in the schools particularly. There hasn't been for, several decades. But look at the shows that are popular on television. The Voice, American Idol. These shows about performing and singing, people are starved for this. And they will find a way. talent is always going to find a way to express itself. So if you think, people ask me this a lot, what's the future of opera? Well, if you look 50, 100 years ago at what opera was, we do it very different now. So in 50 to 100 years, it's going to be very different again in unimaginable ways, especially with the technology that we have. I think there's going to be a movement back to smaller spaces, more grassroots efforts. I do think, though, that if it is going to reach people more broadly, we have to find a way to get it back into education right from the beginning. It is nowhere in popular culture right now. It's all the singing and everything for popular culture is this very unhealthy singing, you know. It's like basically screaming. But you'll notice on those shows, when they hear a trained voice, they're blown away. I think the reason people resist opera, if they do at all, is because they haven't been exposed to it. They don't know how great it is, or they haven't been around a great singer. When you're in the room with a great singer and everything is vibrating, it's indescribable. It's like looking at the Grand Canyon for the first time. You cannot describe that, you know? You have to experience it yourself. I see a very bright future for opera in this country. There is so much new opera being commissioned right now, and it is where all the innovation is. In the for-profit art form of Broadway or popular music, there isn't as much innovation, which is why things have actually become a little stagnant in that field. But in this field, which is not for profit, which is actually a good thing for the field, you are finding more invention and more creativity, different kinds of composers, different stories, different ways of telling stories, different kinds of spaces, brave singers, brave composers, brave conductors who are really willing to explore. And the other key to that is we have a group in the country called Opera America, which started off about 40 years ago. It's centralized in New York. It was a way for opera companies to communicate and share stories about, you know, commission costs or production costs to find out about other productions. Suddenly, the New Works project is huge for them. It is the most well-attended part of their annual meeting. New works, new productions. And they've just opened a National Opera Center. Who knew that in the 21st century in the United States of America, we would be the country that has a national center for opera in New York? That says an enormous amount about how the world of it is growing, the sense of community about it, and a very optimistic statement for the future. Everyone who was at that opera house last night or goes to a new opera is saying they believe in the future. And the singers that are there are saying they believe in the future, and the whole community around it is saying they believe in the future. And that is tremendously encouraging. So I'm very optimistic about it. Is it going to be tough? Are there going to be battles? Is it going to be expensive? Yes, all of that. But where there is talent and where there are ideas, people are going to find a way to make this work in the future. Is it going to be like what we're doing today? No, no. But that's exciting too.
John Bryant has had his hand up. We'll give him the last question.
Well, well, I've read Moby-Dick 35 times.
You win.
And it is a competition. No, I think just to respond to your question about scholars and critics, they can't wait to see your opera. I saw it last February, and it was just unbelievable. A wonderful interpretation, and I think the reason is that we just want to have more people to talk to about this book and about Melville, which leads me to my question. It's not so much about the future of opera, which you have, I think you have contributed to the future of opera with this work, but what is the future of Gene and Jake? Now I have some. Now I have an important question, because. We want more Melville. We've been talking about the having to make choices and all those chapters that Sam was talking about that aren't there, the Ishmael chapters, and you've written songs. And my sense of those Ishmael chapters is that they are songs, that they are meditations, there's essays that this one person has to go through in order to get through this dramatic experience that he's had. And I was wondering, actually begging hoping, imploring that sometime, I know you have your careers and things like that. But had you thought about creating a song cycle called Ishmael, of something like that? In other words, using those materials as a basis.
Clearly you have.
Can we talk? I'm from New York, so I can.
I'd just like to piggyback on that question and remind you all that there will be a reception down the hall at which those of you who haven't had a chance to ask your questions will have the opportunity. But I'd just like to piggyback on that question. And if there's anything more you want to say about the possibility of a Ishmael song cycle, that's fine. But I thought it also might be nice to end with you giving the audience a sense of what's next for both of you, whether it's Melville or not, separately and together, what projects you're working on now.
Regarding the whole Ishmael song cycle, I had not considered that. I do love Melville, and I loved being in the world of it so much that I'm writing my next big project, which will premiere in April, is an Ahab symphony for chorus and tenor soloist and orchestra, and it's juxtaposing Melville's death as portrayed in the poem Herman Melville by Auden, with the final chapters of Moby-Dick, the heroic end that he gave to Ahab, you know, and that was Gene's idea, to find those two things. So that is definitely in the future. Gene and I have talked. There are the letters between Melville and Hawthorne. If there were a brilliant playwright who could put together a play between those two characters, where the unknown situations of them. I mean, whose letters still exist?
No, I said
Melville's
letters to Hawthorne exists, but Hawthorne's letters to Melville have been lost. And I would say it was like Possession by A.S. Byatt. If a great novelist is, I think it's be a great idea.
Or a playwright.
Yeah.
I thought of it as actually as a music theater piece too.
Yeah, but you'd have to write convincingly in Hawthorne's voice. Yeah. So, but and also know as much as you folks know about these guys. So, but that's an incredible story. Yeah. The relationship between them and this mentor relationship and how we're not going to go there now, but how the whole book changed because of that relationship is an incredible story. So.
And are there other projects you're working on together at present?
Yep.
Yes,
we have an opera that we can't tell you about because it hasn't been announced, but that we're both very excited about. We have a one-act chorus opera together. We have a new song cycle together. We have a lot of projects down the line. So we love working together, so we always will. Gene just finished the libretto for a new opera with composer Jennifer Higdon.
It's based on Cold Mountain, and it's for Santa Fe. It's for a few years from now.
Right. And I'm at work on a new opera with Terrence McNally, which is an original comic opera, a backstage comedy where a great singer comes back to her hometown for the first time to perform a never-before-heard bel canto opera called Rosa Dolorosa, Daughter of Pompeii. Anyway, so that's a little far from Melville, but you know, but there will always be this connection, and I just fell in love with the sound world that I found in it, and also the language of Melville and how much we had to leave out, that I decided that I wanted to do this symphony to explore some more that language. But it's not an Ishmael song cycle. Yeah.
I remind you that there are flyers for Bob Wallace's book on the Moby-Dick opera, for which I think Jake and Gene have written the foreword. Yeah. The flyers are here. I invite you all to the reception, and please join me in thanking Jake Heggie and Gene Scheer. Yeah.